Hey folks! So, while I'm away on vacation, I'm going to be doing a lot of reading, and I want to talk about some great old books that I've read before, had a ton of fun with, and are all available for free. And I have a great list, I have a great lineup, and these are all available online at places like Project Gutenberg or Standard Ebooks, which are both great places to get free books that are in the public domain. Lots of great classics available for you. And I just love them to death, and I want to talk about, again, just a list of books that I really enjoyed. So let's get started. First one on the list that I have very cleverly taped right below the camera is Flatland. Now this one is probably a bit of a layup because I'm a math major, but I really enjoyed Flatland. Flatland is a book about the life of a square, that is his name, who is a square. Just an average run-of-the-mill man just living his life in a two-dimensional world called Flatland. And the book is essentially divided into two parts. The first is kind of a satire of the way of life, of the life that was lived in Victorian, I think it was Victorian England. Yeah, I think Victorian. Basically, it's a satire of, like, gender roles and, like, the social structure. Because in Flatland, the more sides you have, the more valued you are in society. So, like, circles which have, like, many hundreds of sides are clergy or royalty, while most people are the working poor and triangles. And the first half is just a satire of, like, the way that, like, things were done. And the second half is, like, this beautiful little creative fugue on multidimensionality. The square is picked up by a traveling sphere and is transported to both the one-dimensional, I think it's called Lineland, and he goes to even zero-dimensional Dotland, I think. I can't quite remember all of it. It's been a while since I've read it. Been a few years. And then he goes to Spaceland, the home of the sphere, and even considers for a moment what life in 4 dimensions might just be like. And just all in all, it's a great book. It deals with pretty advanced mathematical concepts in a pretty easy to understand, pretty accessible manner, and also serves as a pretty biting commentary on Victorian England and its social mores and how they sort of put people at disadvantage. It was written by a clergyman who was none too happy with some of the ways people were treated. So yeah, pretty cool. In a similar vein, mathematically speaking, there's also Alice in Wonderland, or the Alice stories. Alice in Wonderland was written by Lewis Carroll, who was a mathematician and clergyman as well. Oddly enough, that you could do that a lot back then. But Alice in Wonderland is just, of course, it's a classic children's story, just very imaginative, just a very fun consideration of, oh, what about this? What if you were really small? What if you were really tall? What if you could talk to birds? Just like a fun little trot through it, just a really creative and adventurous landscape. And also some commentary on, like, mathematical things as well, because Lewis Carroll liked to incorporate little bits of that in his work. Very good. Very fun. I had a great time reading it. A Princess of Mars is kind of similar in that it takes place in a strange land, but it doesn't deal with childhood whimsy or wonder or anything like that. If Tarzan is a little bit too racially charged for you, then A Princess of Mars by the same author, Edgar Rice Burroughs, might be worth a look. A Princess of Mars is an old pulp novel which is about just a man who happens to fall into a deep slumber and in his sleep is transported to the land of Barsoom, a kingdom of Mars, and realizes that because of Mars's lower gravity, he can jump higher, he's stronger, even than the other people on Mars, and he becomes a great warrior and adventurer who goes out to save a lost princess. It's a good rip-roaring adventure. I recommend it. I had a great time reading it. It was the first book I read as an ebook, and I read through it in like 2 to 3 days just because it was so much fun and so interesting, and it was massively influential. It's like, it was one of the first like really sci-fi works, sci-fi fantasy, I guess you would say, and it was super, again, just massively influential for all the pulp works and strange fiction that would come to sort of codify the early history of the genre. I'm not saying Star Wars was directly inspired by A Princess of Mars and the John Carter stories, but it wouldn't be too surprising if without Barsoom there wasn't a Tatooine either. Also, A Princess of Mars, just a fun fact, people have described early Superman as a ripoff of John Carter, as someone who travels from one planet to another, and is stronger and faster than the people who live on the new planet, and now that I've seen it that way, I can't unsee it. So, yeah, I just wanted to share that with you. Just be warned. Moving away from science fiction and into more fantasy, there's the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. Lord Dunsany was one of the earliest fantasy writers. He was very influential for, like, lots of, like, the early pulp writers. Influential for Tolkien, who, of course, the Lord of the Rings became one of the most influential fantasy works in its own right. The Book of Wonder specifically, Lord Dunsany didn't write long works, he mainly wrote short stories, and all of the short stories they're just brief little jaunts into fantasy worlds. They go down like potato chips, they're easy to read, they're fun to read, don't take up too much of your time, and they're all just like really creative, fun little places that you can wonder about. And it's nice. It's an interesting way to look at fantasy before Lord of the Rings kind of took over and redefined everything. Moving from sci-fi and fantasy to more horror, in a sense, there's also the short fictions of Poe and Lovecraft. Now, Standard Ebooks has a full copy of all the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. It does not have all the ones for Lovecraft, because Lovecraft's public domain status is debatable. But Poe, one of these days I'm going to have to do a video about Edgar Allan Poe, because he was just truly a literary revolutionary. I consider him one of the first writers to do mystery, science fiction, fantasy, horror, comedy. Not many people appreciate this, but there is a long undercurrent of comedy in lots of Poe's works, and he just did so much of all of these. It's truly like a marvelous and diverse collection, and you really get a sense for like how, again, first mystery stories were written by Edgar Allan Poe, the Dupin stories. You have like lots of like sci-fi fantasy stories. There's the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which is a novel, which you can also get. There was, pardon me, The Man Who Was Used Up. There was, I'm trying to remember some of these. There's a great many, like, weird science stories, sort of in the same tradition of Frankenstein. And just, of course, fantasy horror. You have The Raven, The Telltale Heart, which is more of a psychodrama, but still. Mask of the Red Death. Just lots of like interesting gothic horror, gothic fantasy that he did, and I highly recommend it. Short fiction of Lovecraft. Lovecraft, of course, basically invented a new genre of horror. He basically invented cosmic horror. Massively influential, possibly one of the most influential horror writers of the 20th century. And just reading some of his early stories, which definitely are in the public domain, are still like very fun, very interesting. You can sort of see like how things evolved into his later writings, and that's great. Just really good time. Really love it. Edgar Allan Poe and Lovecraft, absolutely revolutionaries. Lovecraft is, however, it could be very racially charged, so just keep that in mind if that's gonna bother you. And then finally, for the last one, I want to recommend The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. I'm typically not much for poetry. I don't know why. But I decided, since it was short, since it was relatively easy to read, at least I heard, I would read The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, a sort of a Lebanese-American poet who came to the States and wrote these essentially prose poems about the human condition and human life, strongly influenced by both his Maronite Christian faith and the Baha'i faith that he grew up with around him in his hometown in Lebanon. And they're just beautiful poems. They're just fantastic. They have this even, dreamlike flow. They have these beautiful examinations of the human condition. The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. It's simply wonderful. You can read through it in a day. I did. I couldn't stop reading it. I don't really care for poems, but these are spectacular. I cannot recommend it enough. Honestly, if you're going to read any of these, read The Prophet. But yeah, that's some books that I've read and that I really enjoyed. Flatland, Mathematical Fugue, Alice in Wonderland, a little bit of a creative world with some mathematical elements. I'm going to grad school for math, so that's going to appeal to me. Princess of Mars and Book of Wonder. Early fantasies, just fun little jaunts into adventurous, creative worlds. Short fiction of Poe and Lovecraft, just a truly diverse collection of short stories that really helps you see how early horror and science fiction and fantasy came about and how it was evolving over time. And finally, The Prophet, just a lovely little book full of lovely little poems. It's great. I love it to death. Well, that's about everything. Hope to see you the next time around. I'm not sure when I'm gonna schedule this video and what I'm gonna schedule after it, but I hope you enjoy whatever comes next. And I hope you enjoy this. See you later.